In the winter of 1400, deep within the frozen walls of Pontefract Castle, a man once crowned by God began to starve. No sword struck him. No battlefield claimed him. Instead, silence was his killer, and hunger his executioner. This was Richard II, King of England, reduced to skin and bone by those who had once bowed before him. His food withheld. His name erased. His power stolen. But how does a boy king become a paranoid tyrant? And how does a crowned ruler, chosen by divine right, end up wasting away in the dark, betrayed by his own blood? This is the brutal story of how England destroyed one of its own kings, not with war, but with starvation. In the cold, damp corridors of Pontefract Castle, England's most tragic monarch waited to die. But long before the betrayal, the starvation, and the silence, Richard of Bordeaux was just a child, born into privilege, not power. And he was never meant to wear a crown. He entered the world in 1367, in the bustling wine port of Bordeaux, a jewel of English-held France. His father, Edward the Black Prince, was a war legend, a battlefield god whose victories during the 100 Years' War echoed across Europe. Richard's early years were spent in comfort, far from war, raised among servants, tutors, and the towering shadow of his older brother, Edward of Angoulême, the rightful heir to the English throne. But fate is cruel to children. In 1371, when Richard was just 4, his brother died suddenly of a mysterious illness. No one saw it coming. And in an instant, the invisible child became heir to one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. The loss of his brother was more than just a family tragedy. It shattered the natural order of succession, placing the weight of an empire onto the narrow shoulders of a boy who had barely learned to write his name. Then, only 5 years later, that fragile world collapsed again. His father, the invincible Black Prince, began to waste away from what some believe was dysentery or cancer, contracted during the brutal Spanish campaigns. Richard, barely 9, was forced to watch his hero wither into a ghost. The strongest man he knew, reduced to coughing blood into linen sheets. And in 1376, the Black Prince died. Less than a year later, Richard's grandfather, King Edward III, followed him into the grave. And so, in July 1377, the boy became king. 10 years old. Crowned with gold at Westminster Abbey while barely tall enough to sit on the throne without a cushion. Surrounded by scheming nobles who smiled as they pledged loyalty, and secretly plotted how best to control the child who wore the crown. From the very beginning, Richard's reign was built on instability. A regency council governed in his name, dominated by his ambitious uncle, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. The realm was in debt. The 100 Years' War raged on. French raids ravaged the southern coast. Taxation soared. And the common people simmered with fury. This wasn't a kingdom. It was a tinderbox, and the boy on the throne was no firefighter. But Richard wasn't stupid. He was observant, sensitive. And underneath the ceremonial robes and jeweled crown was a child growing up inside a political minefield. The trauma of his youth, of watching his father die, of being used as a pawn, planted seeds that would grow into obsession. Obsession with control, with divine right, with the fear that everyone around him was waiting for the moment he failed. And in 1381, that moment nearly came. At just 14 years old, Richard faced the greatest internal threat to royal power in centuries, the Peasants' Revolt. Tens of thousands of armed commoners, led by the fiery Wat Tyler and preacher John Ball, rose up. They stormed London, set fire to manor houses, executed tax collectors, and even breached the Tower of London itself. And for the first time, the boy king had to act alone. What he did next would shock everyone, and reveal the dark instincts that would one day destroy him. June 1381. London was on fire. Peasants from Kent and Essex had surged into the capital. Tens of thousands of them, angry and armed, wielding scythes, pitchforks, and a righteous fury that no noble could contain. Their rage had been building for years, after famine, plague, and punishing taxes meant to fund foreign wars. The final insult had come in the form of the third poll tax, a flat tax levied on every man, woman, and child, no matter their income. The poor paid the same as the rich, and it broke them. Now they marched on London, burning tax records, beheading officials, and demanding justice. At the center of this chaos was a boy, Richard II, just 14 years old. With most of his court paralyzed by fear, it was Richard who stepped forward. He rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End. It was a gamble, an untested teenager facing an armed mob. But Richard, calm and composed, spoke to the crowd with regal confidence. "You shall have no captain but me," he declared. And for a moment it worked. Some rebels dispersed, believing they'd won the king's favor. But the rebellion didn't end. What Tyler, charismatic, ruthless, and burning with fury, remained unconvinced. On June 15, he met Richard at Smithfield to negotiate directly. The two stood face to face, surrounded by hundreds of onlookers. Tyler demanded radical reforms: abolition of serfdom, fair wages, land for the people. Richard nodded, stalled. But then chaos. Accounts differ, but something set Tyler off. Some say he drew his dagger. Others claim he spat insults at the king. In a flash, the Lord Mayor of London lunged forward and stabbed Tyler through the neck. He collapsed, dying. The crowd surged, ready to erupt in vengeance. And that's when Richard did the unthinkable. He stepped forward alone, no guards, no sword, and shouted to the mob, "I am your king. I will be your leader. Follow me." The rebels, stunned, obeyed. He led them away from the body of their slain captain, and within days the rebellion was over. It was one of the boldest acts of political theater in English history, and it worked. But there was no forgiveness waiting behind the king's calm face. Within weeks, Richard ordered mass executions. Rebel leaders were hanged. Promises he'd made, pardons, reforms, freedom, were torn apart. The boy who had faced a mob with courage now showed the darker side of his ambition: a cold willingness to betray and destroy to preserve his rule. The peasants' revolt had changed him. The mask of innocence slipped. Richard had faced the abyss and survived. And what he learned was this: fear worked. Betrayal could be useful. And power, true power, came from breaking your enemies when they least expected it. But England was watching. And the nobles, those who once saw a pliable child on the throne, now saw something else. A king who was beginning to believe he was untouchable. Richard was no longer the trembling boy king. The events of the peasants' revolt had set something ablaze within him: a thirst for dominance, a conviction that he ruled not by consent but by divine right. In the years that followed, England watched a strange transformation unfold. At just 16, Richard married Anne of Bohemia, a quiet, gentle woman whose influence softened him for a time. But as their marriage grew, so did Richard's paranoia. He distrusted his uncles, especially John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster. To Richard, they weren't protectors of the crown, they were predators circling the throne he was born to claim. So he began to purge. Advisors loyal to Gaunt were dismissed. New favorites were elevated: men like Michael de la Pole and Robert de Vere, ambitious nobles who fed Richard's ego and encouraged his authoritarian instincts. He created lavish titles, handed out lands, and drained the treasury to reward his inner circle. Parliament grew uneasy. The nobility whispered. England, already bruised by war and revolt, was now under the grip of a boy obsessed with ceremony, luxury, and absolute power. He demanded to be called Your High Majesty. He began dressing like a Byzantine emperor: robes of gold, pearls sewn into his shoes, crowns crafted with rare jewels. He built palaces not for defense but for beauty. England hadn't seen a king like this before: theatrical, refined, almost aloof. But behind the velvet curtains was a rising storm. Richard began to envision kingship not as a duty, but as a divine right, something above law, beyond accountability. Parliament? It existed only to obey him. The nobles? They were tools to be manipulated or crushed. And in 1386 the pushback began. The wonderful Parliament, as it would be called, demanded Richard dismiss his corrupt favorites and submit to a council of nobles. Richard refused. He threatened to summon an army. But England was not ready to fall under tyranny. The nobles, led by the Duke of Gloucester, forced his hand, and Richard blinked. Temporarily. He played along, allowed his enemies to believe he was tamed. But in secret he plotted. By 1387 his patience snapped. He raised a private army led by his loyal friend Robert de Vere and marched against the Lords Appellant, a coalition of noble rebels who now saw Richard as a tyrant in the making. But the king miscalculated. De Vere's army was crushed at Radcot Bridge. Richard was humiliated, arrested, and dragged before a court of nobles. Dozens of his closest allies were executed. De Vere fled into exile. The crown, once heavy on a child's head, now hung by a thread. But Richard did not break. He bided his time. Smiled in council meetings. Signed reforms. Played the role of the humbled king. But behind his silence, something darker was festering. He hadn't forgotten. He was waiting. Waiting to strike. Because Richard II was not done. He was merely sharpening his knives. For nearly a decade Richard played the long game. Outwardly he appeared tamed, obedient to Parliament, respectful to the lords who had once threatened his rule, almost humble. But beneath the surface, Richard II was quietly sharpening the knife. He hadn't forgotten 1387, the humiliation of the merciless Parliament, the execution of his closest allies, the way the old nobility stripped him of dignity and authority. He had bided his time, waiting for the moment the old guard grew complacent. And when it came, Richard struck with precision. In 1397 he unleashed his fury. The first to fall were the Lords Appellant, the very men who had defied him a decade earlier. Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester, Richard's own uncle, was arrested without warning and sent to Calais. He would never return. Officially he died of natural causes, but everyone understood what that meant. Richard had ordered his quiet execution. Others followed. Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, executed. Thomas Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, exiled. Their estates confiscated, their names blackened, their families ruined. Parliament, once defiant, now stood paralyzed in awe and fear as Richard tore through the nobility with legal finesse. He wrapped his vengeance in ceremony, cloaking tyranny in the language of justice. This wasn't a mad tyrant lashing out. It was cold, deliberate revenge. Richard now ruled like a monarch from another world, more emperor than king. He declared that English kings were above the law. His word was divine. He demanded his subjects kneel, not as political inferiors, but as worshippers before a God-chosen sovereign. Dissent became blasphemy. Treason became easier to define. It was anything Richard said it was. To finance his growing appetite for power and luxury, Richard expanded a new program, forced loans. Wealthy subjects were invited to gift large sums to the crown, with vague promises of repayment. Those who hesitated found themselves accused of treason. It was extortion masquerading as loyalty. By 1398, England was no longer a constitutional monarchy in practice. It was a velvet-cloaked autocracy. But Richard's delusions didn't end with control. He now envisioned a reign that would last forever, or at least one that would never be questioned. He created a vast network of spies and informants, encouraging subjects to denounce each other. Fear ruled the court. Nobles whispered behind doors, unsure which word might seal their fate. And yet, despite all this cruelty, Richard remained strangely adored by a small circle. They saw him not as mad but visionary, a cultured, refined king surrounded by savages. He spent lavishly on art, architecture, pageantry. He had his portrait painted like a divine being, the first English monarch to do so. But all of it, the vengeance, the glamour, the tyranny, masked the core truth: Richard was alone. Anne of Bohemia, the one person who had anchored him, was gone. His child bride Isabella could not fill that void. His court was full of flatterers, not friends. The more power he seized, the fewer hands were left to hold him back from the abyss. He ruled like a god, but even gods can fall. And in 1399, his worst fear would return in the form of a familiar face, and a claim to everything Richard thought he had secured. Richard's fate was sealed not in the chaos of war, but in the silence of political isolation. After returning from Ireland, he was no longer king in anything but name. His nobles had fled, his armies had dissolved, and even his most loyal supporters could no longer defend his erratic decisions. The man who once believed himself divinely appointed now stood entirely alone, abandoned not just by power but by history itself. Richard took refuge at Flint Castle in Wales, a cold and looming fortress where the stone walls echoed with the ghosts of defeat. It was here that Henry Bolingbroke arrived, not as a petitioner or cousin, but as a conqueror cloaked in legalism. Their meeting was carefully staged. Henry offered Richard a choice: abdicate the throne peacefully and be promised safety and comfort, or resist and face the consequences. In truth, it was no choice at all. Richard, perhaps still clinging to the memory of cousinly loyalty, surrendered. He agreed to abdicate, hoping his submission might buy him a quiet life in retirement. But he misunderstood the nature of the game he was caught in. Power, once seized, could not afford to leave rivals alive. The abdication ceremony took place at Westminster Abbey. Richard, dressed not as a king but as a man stripped of authority, relinquished the crown, the scepter, and the seal. In a symbolic gesture, he handed over not just the instruments of monarchy but his identity, his dignity, his place in the world. All of England's political class witnessed the event, an elaborate theater designed to make Henry IV's claim appear legitimate, and Richard's end seem voluntary. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the truth. A king had been deposed by force. And the man who now sat on the throne knew that as long as Richard lived, his rule was haunted by the shadow of a rightful monarch. Richard was taken to the Tower of London, not yet a dungeon but no longer a palace. For weeks he was treated decently. He had food, clothing, a few attendants. Henry needed time to see how the country would react. But rumors soon spread, whispers of rebellions, of plots to free Richard, to restore him. Real or imagined, these threats made Richard's continued existence intolerable. The shift was subtle but decisive. His attendants were dismissed. His letters went unanswered. His diet was quietly reduced. What began as confinement slowly twisted into something darker. He was moved to Pontefract Castle, a grim, isolated fortress in the north. Fewer eyes, less scrutiny. The perfect place for a slow death. And that's what it became. The man who had once demanded nobles bow to him like Eastern emperors was now left to starve. His meals, when they came, were pitiful. His strength faded. His mind, once sharp and suspicious, unraveled under the weight of hunger and solitude. Reports say he grew gaunt, skeletal, unrecognizable even to those who knew him. The mirror, once his constant companion, was now his enemy. There was no sword, no executioner. Just time, silence, and an empty plate. By February 1400, Richard of Bordeaux, grandson of Edward III, son of the Black Prince, crowned king at 10, died not on the battlefield but on a filthy cot, bones showing through paper-thin skin. Killed not by blade or fire but by betrayal, politics, and starvation. And yet, even in death, Richard remained dangerous. Henry IV couldn't risk the rise of a martyr. So what came next was not mourning, but propaganda. Henry IV may have worn the crown, but he couldn't silence the ghost he had created. Richard II was dead, starved in a stone prison, but his presence lingered, in whispers, in doubt, and in the bloodied conscience of a divided kingdom. For all the care taken to script his downfall, the former king's corpse told a story that no decree or proclamation could erase. His skeletal remains, paraded before the public, provoked horror. It was supposed to be closure. Instead, it became a question that gnawed at England. Was this justice, or murder? Richard had always been proud, sometimes fatally so, but no one deserved to die like that. Not even a failed king. Rumors spread like wildfire, that he'd been betrayed by a promise of mercy, that he'd cried out for food in his final hours, that his jailers had wept but obeyed. Chroniclers sympathetic to Richard whispered the truth in ink long after his bones were buried. The king hadn't died of sickness. He'd been starved. Slowly. Deliberately. And people remembered. Though Henry had won the crown, the manner of Richard's death tainted his reign from the beginning. Former loyalists muttered in taverns and chapels. Foreign monarchs viewed England with suspicion. Could a country that murdered its own anointed king be trusted to honor treaties, alliances, marriages? Henry tried to seal the cracks. He ordered Richard's body buried at King's Langley, a quiet resting place, far from Westminster, far from public veneration. But even that wasn't enough. The choice was telling: a remote priory instead of a royal tomb. A burial designed not to honor but to erase. To ensure Richard would never become a martyr. But ghosts don't stay buried. Years later, when Henry's own position had grown more secure and rebellions had been crushed, he did something curious. He ordered Richard's body exhumed and reinterred at Westminster Abbey, beside Anne of Bohemia, the woman Richard had truly loved, the only person who had ever steadied his madness. What? Perhaps Henry hoped it would soothe a restless nation. Or perhaps, deep down, it was guilt. An admission that what had been done could never be undone. Their final resting place was beautiful. A carved tomb side by side, hands clasped in death as they might have been in life. But no monument could disguise the horror that preceded it. No gesture could fully cleanse the crime. For all the grandeur of Westminster, England still remembered the starving king at Pontefract. Richard's story by then had become a fable, used by both monarchists and rebels to illustrate different kinds of truth. To some, he was the cautionary tale, a weak, paranoid tyrant whose vanity brought ruin. To others, he was the betrayed sovereign, slaughtered by ambition and surrounded by traitors in noble robes. The real Richard? He was all of it. A lonely boy king forced to wear a crown too soon. A tyrant drunk on divine right. A grieving husband. A cruel ruler. A victim of calculated revenge. And in the end, a ghost that never quite left the halls of English power. Richard II was long dead. His bones sealed in stone. But England could never bury what he represented. His ghost lingered, not just in the corridors of Westminster, but in the minds of kings who followed. Henry IV may have taken the throne, but the stain of usurpation never faded. Every monarch after him lived with the precedent Richard's death had set, that a king could be unmade, that divine right could be stripped away, that crowns were not sacred. They were vulnerable. And that idea, that a ruler could be judged, deposed, and even eliminated, would echo through English history like a curse. Henry Ivy's own reign was fraught with rebellion and instability. Richard's loyalists rose in arms more than once, crying his name as a martyr. It became clear, Richard hadn't just died, he had transformed. From a flawed, hated monarch into a symbol of legitimacy, of betrayal, of the unbearable weight of power. Even Shakespeare, writing nearly 2 centuries later, couldn't resist the tragedy of it all. In the tragedy of King Richard II, he portrayed Richard not as a villain, but as a broken man, a poetic soul undone by the merciless grind of kingship. A man who believed too deeply in the divine right of kings, only to discover that divine favor meant nothing in the face of ambition and steel. Let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, Shakespeare has Richard say, and perhaps no line captures better the heartbreak of his downfall. A ruler who saw himself as chosen by God, reduced to begging for bread, imprisoned by men who once bowed before him. But the deeper tragedy? It was not just Richard's death. It was what England learned from it. The Plantagenet dynasty never recovered its stability. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal series of civil wars that would rip the country apart, can trace their roots directly back to the moment Richard fell. The line between king and subject had been blurred. Once a crown was taken by force, others would try to take it too. Richard's downfall didn't just break a man. It broke the spell of monarchy itself. And centuries later, that same shadow loomed over Charles I, another king who believed in absolute power, another monarch who faced rebellion, and another ruler who would die at the hands of his own people. When Charles stood before his executioner in 1649, many whispered that he had become another Richard, proud, isolated, and destined to die because he mistook God's will for political immunity. History, it seems, has a cruel rhythm. Richard II was not the worst king England ever had. Nor was he the best. But he was perhaps the most tragic. Not because he died, but because he believed so deeply that he never could. His downfall remains one of the most haunting in royal history, not just for how it ended but for what it revealed. That behind every throne sits a man. Mortal. Breakable. Alone. And no matter how golden the crown or divine the claim, in the end even a king can starve.